This week at Lebanon Road, we're talking about the Lord's Supper. Along with Andrew Pate and J.D. Buckner, I'm Adam Fallen. It's time for our triumvirate week during the month. The trifecta, that's right. The Lord's Supper is one of those acts of worship that we participate in each Lord's Day. And we have a special reason that we're talking about it this week here on the videos. We'll get to that in just a minute. But guys, before we get to that reason, we eat the Lord's Supper every Sunday. Why? Is it something we're supposed to be doing?
Well, I think so. Maybe we should mention too, before we get started, that we are in the Lord's Supper room.
Right. See what we did there?
Yeah, on location in the
right.
Lord's Supper room.
On Sunday evenings, the people who cannot be at worship Sunday morning, we're actually in the room where they get together to eat the Lord's Supper. But we read in the gospel accounts that Jesus changed that Passover feast to what we often call communion or the Lord's Supper. The same night he was betrayed, he took bread, he offered thanks, he spread it among the apostles. They ate of it. He took the cup, the fruit of the vine, he passed it among the apostles, and they ate of it. And if we're not careful, though, we can leave that in the Gospels. We can say, well, Jesus did that with the apostles. He did that in Matthew 26, and all those other passages. Mm-hmm. And Jesus did a lot of things with the apostles that the early church did not do. He performed miracles, and not everybody in the early church performed miracles. Jesus, gave the Sermon on the Mount. That doesn't mean everybody in the early church gave the Sermon on the Mount. But we also see the early church coming together and eating the Lord's Supper.
Yeah, absolutely. Acts chapter 2, Acts chapter 4, said they came together when they broke bread and they had all things in common. And when we started to talk about the importance of the Lord's Supper today, I couldn't help but think about Acts chapter 20 and verse 7. And you asked the question at the beginning, why do we partake of the Lord's Supper? And why is it important to us today? Maybe it's just how I read Acts 20 and verse 7. Maybe other people don't read it this way. But it says, upon the first day of the week, when the disciples came together to break bread, Paul preached to them, ready to depart on the morrow, and continued his speech unto midnight. I see that while all the acts of worship are equally as important, this Bible passage tells me they came together for the purpose of taking the Lord's Supper, to break bread, as the New Testament calls it. So I see a lot of importance there placed on the partaking of the Lord's Supper.
Yeah, they came together to break bread. There was something very central in their focus around that particular aspect of worship. Andrew, I see you have your Bible open to one of the most famous passages in the New Testament that speaks about the Lord's Supper. 1 Corinthians 11. What are some things in that passage, and why, when we mentioned this, when you walked up here and your Bible just fell open to 1 Corinthians 11? Why do you have your Bible open there?
Well, it's just basically going over the things that we have to do when we partake of the Lord's Supper. Especially starting in verse 23 and on down, it just basically reiterates what, written in red, what Jesus has said, that we are commanded to do. And it's, I think sometimes we forget that, that this is a very sacred time for us. As we know that every part of worship is very sacred, but this, for me personally, is a time when I can reflect about the things that Jesus did for me upon the cross. And if it doesn't move you, then I don't think you're exactly partaking of it in the right way, because just thinking of the things that he went through upon that cross and why we are worthy to partake of his body, to me is very humbling.
Yeah.
I think that goes back to what you were saying too about some things Jesus did with just his apostles. But here, like Andrew just mentioned, Paul is reiterating this to the church at Corinth. So if it was only something for Jesus and the apostles to do, why would it be here also, Paul telling everyone else to do it?
Right, and he makes it, as Andrew mentioned, that passage very clear. This is something serious. And I don't want to chase this rabbit, but I will mention briefly that every avenue of worship, all 5 of the avenues of worship, are things that are personal and community or communal, but there is none more personal than the Lord's Supper. I mean, there is a community aspect of it, we're eating it together, but there is nothing more personal to me in worship than eating the bread, drinking the fruit of the vine. There is a community aspect to it,
right,
but it is so personal. And the Lord's Supper is something we do each and every week. I've heard it said before that some other religious groups only partake of it quarterly or at special events, and that makes it more special. I don't see how to do something less often shows it's more special. I never have figured that out.
Yeah.
And so, kind of, not the announcement we're making, but kind of the news we're breaking in some ways here on the video. You're going to read about this week's bulletin, hear about it tonight at worship. It's nothing that we're, breaking specifically, but we're going to be taking some time at Lebanon Road here beginning this coming Sunday, the first Sunday in March, to really emphasize the Lord's Supper in a stronger way. We're going to continue to eat it every Sunday because that's what the Bible commands. But we are also going to take just a few moments. Andrew, JD, Brother Harry, or I, one of the four of us. Brother Harry will actually be the one this Sunday. We'll take about 3 or 4 or 5 minutes before we eat the Lord's Supper to remind us of what we're doing. And I'm thankful this is not something that just came from our elders. This is something that really started with some of our members, some of our deacons saying, this is something we need to do, to really, as you mentioned from Acts 20 and verse 7, to come together for that purpose and to focus our mind on that avenue, that aspect of worship.
Greater emphasis on the Lord's Supper. That has been the desire from the congregation, the deacons, through the elders, and I think that speaks really highly of Lebanon Road. I'm proud that they want to do that, to place a greater emphasis on the Lord's Supper, and I think that's very biblical, what we've talked about today.
I definitely think that a lot of times there's not a really good communication between the congregation and the elders, and here it's just, it shows the love, it shows the want, it shows the determination to give God all the glory, and I think you should be commended. We should all be commended here at Lebanon Road for the things that are going on here. It's very exciting and very humbling and just a great thing that's going on.
Yeah, it may not seem like a very huge change, but it is easy. And we'll kind of transition here to where we're going to close up today, and that's with some how we can be, personally eating the Lord's Supper and concentrating on that. But we for years, before I moved here, I know when we sing a song before we eat the Lord's Supper that usually deals with the cross or with Jesus, and that's wonderful. But it's so easy to sing those 2 or 3 verses, get through the Lord's Supper, so we can sing a song and get to the sermon, so we can get through this. Everything just hurries through. And in some ways, and this is the preacher saying this, the sermon sort of becomes the central focus. And that's not the way it should be. And that's me saying that. The Lord's Supper should be the central focus. And so this is a way to kind of bring that back, to make sure that our minds are focused there on the cross, on Jesus. We mentioned this is something that is personal. I'm going to ask you guys here just very briefly, what's something or a couple of things that you have done or you do regularly before or as you eat the Lord's Supper to help you in your concentration?
I really will turn to one of the Gospels, and I will try to read the account of Jesus being nailed upon the cross. I'm a very visual person, and so I will close my eyes and I will just sometimes even think of the grunts, think of the things that were going on while Jesus was being beaten, and that for me it helps me visualize what was happening. And, thinking of the nails going through the hands, the splinters going through my back, things that Jesus did, and that really brings me to the cross.
So reading the passage or just kind of concentrating on what it actually says, that's good. JD, what's something you've done or still do?
Well, I usually pray. It's difficult sometimes to, like you said, to take that moment to concentrate, especially if you're like us. We've got children who can try to steal our attention during those moments, but I always start out with a deep breath for some reason, and it's just like, okay, clear it away, and let's think about what's very important now. And I segment my prayers, like when we partake of the body, I think about Jesus on earth and the teachings that he gave to us and how he set up the New Testament, his church, all the body of his teaching, I guess, is not just his body on the cross, but the things he did in life, which was a true sacrifice for him as well, those 33 years or whatever. And then when I pray about the juice, I think about the washing of the redemptive aspect of his blood, and that he could wash away my sins, not only teach me how to live, but also prepare me for eternity by washing my sins away. So those are the things I try to think about to make the Lord's Supper as important to me personally.
That's good to think about all the aspects of Jesus and what he did and came through. One thing I don't do it as much anymore, is I used to read those hymns. One different than when we sang, especially some of the the older ones kind of written almost King Jamesy English. You know, there's something about that, just the depth of what Oh Sacred Heavens, when I used to read all the time. You know, I just read that constantly. Because it took some thinking. You know, it wasn't just when you ran through the words and you got it. It took some thinking. Now I spend more time in prayer, and it's, you know, part of that, frankly, is because I'm getting ready to preach. I'm trying to keep my brain on what I'm doing instead of what I'm getting ready to do. All of these are helpful. I've known people who journal, who have maybe the back of a attendance card, or bring just a little notebook and write, you know, what they're thinking about, and that helps them. Whatever it takes to make it personal. But I'm thankful, as we mentioned, that we have the Lord's Supper first and foremost, but then also that Lebanon Road is taking this as an opportunity to really concentrate on it, put the focus on it. Greater emphasis has been the phrase, you know, we've been throwing around constantly for several months on the Lord's Supper, and I'm looking forward to that. We have a lot of things upcoming. We're not going to bore you with a bunch of announcements because we've bored you enough with with a long video this week. But Young at Heart have their game day tomorrow. That's the next thing on the calendar. A lot of things coming up in March, and we look forward to be back with you again next Wednesday for these videos. Until then, this is This Week at Lebanon Road.